This story begins softly, almost casually, but with a force that deeply unsettled British experts and drew the attention of researchers connected to the work of Ian Stevenson. It all started when a 6-year-old English girl, living in an ordinary neighborhood in Canterbury in the early 1970s, spontaneously described the day-to-day routine of a 19th-century military hospital, a place she couldn't possibly have known, one that didn't even exist anymore in her time. Her name was Clara Mason, and according to her, she had been a nurse during the Crimean War, working under the direct supervision of Florence Nightingale. The first clues surfaced on a seemingly typical school day. The teacher was explaining basic modern first aid, a simple lesson adapted for children. But Clara interrupted the explanation, remarking, "You have to boil bandages, or the smell of blood won't come out." She said it with the conviction of someone describing a mundane chore. The whole room fell quiet. The teacher, unsure how to respond, made a note of the incident and spoke to the parents at the end of the lesson. The Mason family lived a classic English life. The mother worked part-time at a small sweet shop. The father was a bus driver. There were no books about wars in the house and no family connections to nursing or the military. Yet later that afternoon, while stirring a steaming cup of tea, Clara effortlessly spoke of the damp corridors where the soldiers were brought in after fighting in the cold. One day, when asked how she knew this, she simply replied, "I've been there. It was Scutari. We kept everything clean, just like Florence ordered." The mother was perplexed by the name. She'd never heard Clara mention it. She asked who Florence was, and the girl simply stated, "She walked around with a lamp to check on the injured at night." This description was an exact match for the historical image of Florence Nightingale, known as the Lady with the Lamp, information that had never been discussed at home. When the mother searched for an illustrated book on British history at the local library, she found the same figure holding the lamp. Showing the photo to Clara, the girl calmly commented, "She always did that." Over the following weeks, Clara repeatedly began drawing what she called the big building where everything happened. Narrow windows, beds lined up side by side, long halls with hanging lights. When the mother compared the child's drawings with old images of the Scutari military hospital, she noticed a resemblance that was deeply troubling. The proportions, though childish, were accurate. The parents sought medical advice. The town doctor examined the girl and found no signs of confusion, fever, hallucinations, or behavioral disorders. He referred the case to child psychology, where again, nothing suggested a pathological fantasy. At this point, a British researcher who was familiar with Ian Stevenson's methods learned of the story and decided to investigate. And what he observed during his first contact with Clara raised questions that went beyond any conventional explanation. When the researcher associated with Ian Stevenson's work arrived in Canterbury, he found a cautious family who were nonetheless eager to understand what was happening. Before interviewing Clara, he asked the parents to report, without interruption, all the episodes they had observed since the first strange remark. The mother methodically described every detail, including the girl's persistence in using the term pavillon inférieur, lower pavilion, wing, a phrase not part of modern British vocabulary, but one that appeared in 19th century military hospital documents. The first conversation with Clara took place in a quiet room at the local school. No prompts, no leading questions, just open inquiries. The girl was calm. When asked about the place she had mentioned, she naturally replied, "It was a very large hospital. The men came in sick from the cold and the sea. Some couldn't talk." The researcher asked if she remembered anyone giving orders. Clara nodded and said, "Miss Florence, she told us we had to keep our hands clean, even if the water was dirty." The precision of the statement immediately caught his attention. Historical records describe water scarcity and a lack of sanitation as constant issues at Scutari, which Florence Nightingale tried to combat with almost military discipline. Clara, who had no access to historical material, described the same difficulty as a direct memory. The researcher then asked Clara to draw the hospital again. He didn't intervene or ask questions during the process. Within minutes, the girl sketched the shape of a rectangular building with an inner courtyard, as well as a separate area where, she said, the weakest men were kept. The drawing, though clearly a child's, matched the known layout of the Scutari Barrack Hospital, a multi-story structure that had been quickly repurposed to house thousands of wounded. At the end of the meeting, the girl spontaneously mentioned a name: Anne. When the researcher asked who that was, Clara replied, "That was me. I was Anne." She couldn't recall the surname but described working in the lower part of the building near the room with the dressing kits. She also mentioned that Miss Florence once told me I had to rest, which is consistent with historical accounts of Nightingale making nightly rounds and often instructing exhausted nurses to take a temporary break. Following this first interview, the researcher summarized the information and sent a detailed report to Stevenson's team, which by then had decades of collected studies on spontaneous childhood memories. The methodology demanded caution. Every historical detail mentioned by the child had to be verified, descriptions compared with documentary evidence, and the possibility of normal learning, contamination from conversations, television, or books had to be thoroughly assessed. The parents were then instructed to note every new remark the girl made in a notebook, always recording the date, time, and context. This family diary became a central part of the investigation. From that point on, Clara's descriptions began to form a coherent whole, consistently linked to the same 19th century hospital routine. And all the while, the possibility of mere chance grew increasingly slim. With the family diary now being kept, Clara's reports became even more specific. The girl seemed to remember fragments that surfaced spontaneously, usually triggered during simple daily tasks like putting away her school supplies or tying her shoes before leaving the house. One day, watching her mother sew on a button, she commented, "We also sewed the bandages, but with thick thread because they tore quickly." The mother immediately noted the phrase. The researcher later confirmed that nurses during the Crimean War did in fact use sturdier thread to reinforce reused cloth as supplies were insufficient. On another morning, helping her father carry shopping bags downtown in Canterbury, Clara looked at the wet ground and said, "The water would run down the walls in the lower corridor when it rained. We put down rags so it wouldn't reach the beds." The father recorded the account as soon as he got home. British archives on the Scutari Barrack Hospital describe constant leaks in the lower corridors, a result of the building's rushed adaptation for medical purposes during the conflict. The detail once again aligned with historical data. The team associated with Ian Stevenson's method decided to conduct a new interview, this time in greater depth and adhering to the non-inductive observation protocol. The meeting took place in a quiet doctor's office, without the parents present, to avoid emotional influence. Clara sat as before, next to a table with blank paper. The researcher simply asked her to talk about the time she looked after the wounded. He didn't mention locations, names, or functions. Clara took a deep breath, like someone searching for a distant memory, and began to speak. "We got there before dark. The smell was strong because the men came from the ship. Some were coughing all the time. Miss Florence walked fast, very fast." The researcher asked what exactly she did. Clara replied, "I washed my hands in warm water, but sometimes it was dirty. We had no choice. We put pieces of cloth on the open wounds and then took them to boil." The statement drew attention due to the contrast between the clarity of the description and the child's young age. Stevenson observed in several of his studies that children with spontaneous memories tended to give consistent, direct, and unadorned accounts, exactly as Clara did. At one point in the interview, the girl frowned as if trying to recall a name. She muttered something like, "Ward C," something like that. The researcher immediately made a note. Days later, during historical verification, a reference was found to lettered sections in the Scutari Hospital, including Wing C, which was designated for seriously wounded patients. The team did not mention this to Clara, maintaining the methodology of avoiding any information that might influence her. As the case progressed, the consistency of the reports began to suggest it wasn't just happenstance. The researchers then decided to investigate whether there were records of anyone named Anne among the nurses working under Florence Nightingale, the name Clara attributed to herself. The search would be time-consuming, as many documents from that period were incomplete. But the team would proceed rigorously to objectively assess the extent to which these memories could be verified. The documentary search began in the British Military Archives, known for collecting reports and partial lists of nurses who served at Scutari under Florence Nightingale's coordination. The team on Clara's case traveled to London to consult the archives kept at the former War Office, where incomplete files, faded signatures, and nursing reports offered a fragmented picture of the work between 1854 and 1856. Most of the helpers and volunteers of that era were not formally recorded in official reports, a fact already noted by historians. Nonetheless, the team found several mentions of nurses identified only by their first name, including a partial record that cited Anne M. without a legible surname. The document proved nothing conclusively, but it drew attention as it matched the name Clara had spontaneously mentioned. Meanwhile, in Canterbury, the parents continued to record their daughter's reports. One day, over breakfast, Clara held her spoon and remarked that at the old hospital, the cutlery was different and almost always went missing. When her mother asked what she meant, she explained, "The soldiers would take them to open letters or cut cloth. We never found them afterward." The note was sent to the researcher, who found a similar reference in a contemporary nurse's report, describing the constant shortage of simple utensils in the hospital due to the wounded men's improvisation. Another detail surfaced during a walk with the researcher. Seeing a flock of pigeons near the train station, Clara said, "They chased the crumbs in the courtyard. We had to shoo them away because they made everything dirty." This comment was later compared to historical accounts of the Scutari courtyard, where animals were commonly seen due to the constant flow of soldiers, provisions, and food scraps. The researcher did not comment on this to the girl. He only noted it. In a new interview, strictly following Stevenson's recommended method, the researcher asked Clara to recount something distinctive from her supposed previous life. She was silent for a few seconds, then said, "There was a night when water was dripping from the ceiling. Everyone was rushing around. Miss Florence was tired, but she held the lamp steady and said we had to keep the men away from the wall." This statement was also recorded without any intervention. Later, architectural records would confirm severe leaks during heavy rain, particularly in the lower section of the building, the area the girl repeatedly mentioned. The researcher also noted the way Clara spoke about Florence. There was no praise or childlike affection. Her descriptions were sober, direct, almost clinical. She walked fast, spoke softly, asked for silence when someone was dying. The tone was more consistent with a report of coexistence than an idealized image. This kind of objectivity was valued by Stevenson's associated researchers as it reduced the likelihood of fantasy. With each new detail verified, the team delved deeper into the historical investigation. One vital element remained missing: understanding whether the memories fit a pattern consistent with other cases documented by Stevenson, such as spontaneous occurrence between the ages of 3 and 7, the use of unusual vocabulary, and the tendency to describe only objective fragments of the alleged previous life. Clara fit all these aspects, which made the case even more relevant for ongoing study. Using the collected records, the team began to analyze Clara's case through the comparative prism, a method often employed in Ian Stevenson studies. The intent was to observe whether the girl's behavioral and linguistic patterns followed the recurring features found in children who reported spontaneous memories of another life. These patterns included the early onset of memories, their gradual fading after the age of 8, the objective precision of the accounts, and the absence of fantastical elements. Clara clearly exhibited all these traits at age 6. A relevant observation came when the parents, following the researchers' instructions, attempted to limit the topic at home to see if the memories depended on external prompting. Despite this, the reports continued to surface spontaneously and briefly, always linked to a simple everyday trigger. One morning, feeling the warm water from the sink on her hands, Clara remarked, "We heated it that way, but sometimes it burned because they put too much coal in to make it boil fast." On another occasion, hearing the sound of cutlery being organized, she murmured, "The instruments were kept together, but the small ones were always missing." These comments were discreet and natural, never formed as long narratives, reinforcing the fragmentary nature of the memories observed in Stevenson's archives. The researcher then decided to compare Clara's vocabulary with terms found in texts from the Crimean War period. He noticed her use of phrases like homens duente du mar, sick men from the sea, likely a reference to soldiers transported on overcrowded ships, and pavillon de baixo, lower pavilion wing, corresponding to the lower wings where the most unstable wounded were housed. The vocabulary was unusual for a contemporary child and completely foreign to her family environment. Neither parent had a connection to nursing, military history, or medical institutions. Another aspect drew attention. Clara seemed to show a kind of emotional familiarity with the figure of Florence Nightingale, but not a childlike attachment. It was as if she were speaking of someone hierarchically above her, but not idealized. During one of the interviews, looking out the sunlit consultation room window, she remarked, "She went around with the light in her hand to see if they were breathing." Hearing this, the researcher noted that the phrase was reminiscent of descriptions of Nightingale's nightly rounds during the war, walking the corridors holding a lamp to discreetly observe the wounded, a fact extensively documented by contemporary witnesses. As the amount of data grew, the team had to establish a more structured line of investigation. The goal was to directly cross-reference Clara's descriptions with historical documents, not to prove a definitive hypothesis, but to objectively assess the accuracy of what was said. This systematic comparison is one of the central phases of the methodology advocated by Stevenson, intended to avoid rushed interpretations or the researcher's personal biases. 3 main areas of investigation were thus solidified: the child's spontaneous reports, the historical verifications, and the absence of a known source for normal learning. Based on this, the team prepared for the next phase of the study, which required a deeper investigation into the alleged environment where Clara, as Anne, was said to have worked, the Scutari Military Hospital at the peak of the Crimean War. To deepen the investigation, the team decided to minutely reconstruct the environment of the Scutari Barrack Hospital using preserved architectural plans, medical reports, letters from contemporary nurses, and descriptions by British officers. The objective was to create a precise historical picture that allowed for a point-by-point comparison of the information provided by Clara. This methodology, widely used in Ian Stevenson's studies, aimed to reduce subjective interpretations and anchor the analysis in verifiable documentation. The initial findings were particularly relevant. Clara had claimed to have worked in the lower part of the building, where water ran down when it rained. Original plans showed that the lower level of the building suffered from leaks due to structural defects and dampness accumulation. Medical reports described the floor as constantly wet, especially in the corridors closest to the courtyard. This detail, noted as one of the pain points for the nurses, matched what the child had spontaneously reported. Another significant piece of data emerged when the girl mentioned that the soldiers arrived from the ship and coughed incessantly. Consulting British medical reports from 1854, the researcher found references to the arrival of entire contingents of debilitated soldiers, many with fever and respiratory infections acquired during the sea transport from the Black Sea. Clara's description fit precisely into the routine of the hospital's first few weeks, when the number of sick drastically exceeded the available structure. Furthermore, the girl had remarked that the small pieces of cutlery went missing. In historical documents, the researcher found observations about the shortage of cutlery and simple utensils, which were frequently improvised for use by the wounded soldiers. These small losses were cited as a source of constant frustration for the nurses in the lower wing, who had to reuse whatever they could find. During this phase of the study, Clara made a comment that captured the team's attention due to its specificity. On a rainy afternoon, looking at the door of the room where she was being interviewed, she whispered, "When the water fell from the ceiling, Miss Florence ordered the beds to be moved away from the wall so mold wouldn't grow." The phrase was noted and later compared with letters from a British nurse who had been at Scutari and reported exactly the same practice: the order to move damp beds away during storms to curb contagion and reduce the smell of mold embedded in the walls. Another one of Clara's memories seemed to convey a feeling more than a specific fact. One day, when asked if she remembered something that bothered her, she replied, "The sound of her steps. We knew when she was coming, even in the dark." Historically, contemporary witnesses reported that Florence Nightingale walked the corridors quietly, but her presence was felt through the rapid pace of her steps and the constant light of the lamp, which discreetly illuminated the floor. With so many converging elements, the team had to move to the most delicate part of the investigation, determining if historical records contained a nurse named Anne who had specifically worked in the lower wing of Scutari. The search would require consulting deteriorated and poorly catalogued documents, many stored in old boxes with almost illegible handwriting. Nevertheless, it was an essential step to objectively assess whether Clara's memory corresponded to a real person or if it was an unlikely but possible coincidence. The final phase of the investigation focused exclusively on the search for a nurse named Anne, who might have been incompletely registered in the Crimean War archives. The team knew, however, that many names of helpers and volunteers were lost or only partially preserved, given the fragmented way the Scutari hospital operated in its first months. Still, the documentary cross-check was vital to maintain the rigor applied by Ian Stevenson in all his studies. Before any conclusion, it was necessary to verify, compare, exclude the improbable, and only retain what stood up to historical analysis. The researcher returned to the archive of the former War Office in London, where, after hours of examining fragile documents, he again found the mention of Anne M. in a staff distribution report. The record was incomplete, with no age or origin information, and only a brief note. Assigned to the lower sector, 1855. Next to this record was a fragmented, almost illegible note mentioning structural difficulties in the lower pavilion, consistent with the area Clara repeatedly described as damp, noisy, and always full of groans. While this finding could not confirm the identity of the alleged nurse, it offered a concrete possibility that aligned with the child's spontaneous memories. Stevenson emphasized in his writings that a single document rarely proves a case. The value lies in the convergence of multiple elements: behavior, vocabulary, internal consistency of the memories, and compatibility with historical records. And Clara's case exhibited exactly this ensemble. Meanwhile, at home, the memories began to lose intensity, something Stevenson also observed in many cases. By the age of 7 or so, Clara was already speaking less about Scutari. Comments that were once spontaneous only surfaced when she was asked, and even then with less clarity. One specific afternoon, when asked by the researcher who Florence was, the girl smiled, as if recognizing a familiar name, but only replied, "She helped a lot of people. I think I helped too." It was evident that the vivid images of the past were fading. The parents' notebook, however, remained a detailed record of this period. It contained over 80 small descriptions, all dated, including the first mentions of the lamp, the damp corridors, the boiled bandages, and the constant sound of coughing soldiers arriving from the sea. When cross-referenced with historical archives, the diary revealed an impressive series of correspondences with no signs of typical childhood fantasy. To conclude the investigation, the team prepared a report following the traditional model used by Stevenson's associated researchers. It concluded that the case met the criteria for relevance: spontaneously occurring memories, absence of a normal learning source, consistent historical convergence, and a behavioral pattern compatible with several earlier studies. The document proposed no definitive explanations, something Stevenson always avoided, but classified the case as strongly suggestive, highlighting its importance for the research into spontaneous childhood memories. In time, Clara completely stopped mentioning the life at Scutari. She grew up, returned to the ordinary routines of English childhood, occupied with school, friends, and the small chores of daily life. But her reports remained registered as one of the most fascinating cases investigated in England under Ian Stevenson's methodological influence. A case where a child described, with surprising precision, fragments of a life that was said to have existed more than a century earlier at the heart of one of the most remarkable episodes in modern nursing history.